1, 2, 3, swing it.
Do you have an old sound tape or your favorite cassette tape that you want converted to CD or MP3 format? Do you need a demo CD, radio ad, a DJ, or even a sound system for your wedding, birthday, or special occasion? Then why not get in contact with KTR Records on 07931 152 448 or check out our website on www.ktrrecords.com. We have been in business since 2004 and we also undertake community projects. So for your remixes, doublets and all your sound editing needs, why not contact KTR Records, official sponsor of World Jam Global Radio. KTR Records, coming your way!
I was terrified about sharing the vulnerabilities of people with difficulties reading and spelling words. However, I can see the value in sharing, and I have taken the time to make some notes about this in my book, Dyslexic: The Silent Difference. You can get your copy now at www.a1tribe.com or amazon.com or amazon.co.uk. Thank you again, everyone, for your support.
Do you like music like this?
Great music all the time.
Or like this?
The music you love.
Maybe this.
Great music that makes you want to turn up the volume loud.
Or like this.
Especially where human life is concerned. Surely, sooner or later, people will realize that lives actually matter.
Then you're in the right place. Keep it locked to World Jam Global, where music is harmony.
Music 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Yeah, you're World Jam. Hotter than them.
See live schedule.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime. Back in the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life is so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now I sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real boy stuff, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd shoot you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Pay for my crime, pay for my crime. I could get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply.
Okay, I want to say thank you for each and every one of you that have joined me right here on Issues Today for another Roundtable. Overkill, The Real Crime, live on World Jam Global Radio. You can join us on www.worldjamglobalradio.com. You can join us on Twitter. You can join us on Issues Today. And you can join us on YouTube Live.
The real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger.
My guests today include Patrick Lane, Scott Rushing, Stephanie Babb, Yolanda McNair, and Dee Martin. And we'll be talking to them very shortly. So stand by.
Already did my time.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Wow! Trying to cope with this living here. Trying to cope with this living here. Yes, I am. Trying to cope with this.
I can confirm that we are live on all platforms.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed will it be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this
Ooh, excuse me, the program is sticking. Don't worry about that.
trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but
Okay,
evil. For thine is the
let's just do this, shall we?
power, the glory, forever.
Okay, I'm going to bring you in live with my guests today. And first and foremost, let me just say, our beloved Teresa has just had her operation last week on replacing her knee. So Teresa can't be with us today, and she's probably not going to be with us for the next couple of weeks, but she's done an amazing job in trying to make sure that everything is in place so Issues Today can do what it does, setting up a platform for families and victims to talk about various issues relating to police brutality, wrongful convictions, and breach of our human and civil rights. But I know that the team are going to miss her. There's a lot of communication that goes on in the background, off air, when Teresa's trying to get everything organised, and she's the one that does most of the talking to our guest speakers before the show, and even offers the aftercare service after the show has finished, bearing in mind that there are some people who open themselves up to wounds, pains and vulnerabilities when they're sharing these stories of their lost loved ones. But Teresa's always there to give a shoulder for them to cry on, for somebody for them to talk to just voice their concerns or even their pain. And I know we all here on the round table and the Issues Today are thinking of her right now as she once again goes through this difficult time. I don't know if you guys have got anything that you want to add to what I've just said.
Get better, Therese. We missed you.
Yes, I agree.
1,000% agree.
Okay, so 1 second as I just try and get this. There we go. Right. Just trying to make sure who we've got. So we've okay. So Yolanda will be joining us very shortly. Yolanda McNair is here. She has been as part of the brief, but she's also at work, and she's trying to make sure that she can make herself available for the 2 hours of the show, and she'll be joining us very shortly. Once we've done that, so we've given Teresa our blessing, our love, our prayers are going up for her, and I'm sure you at home and the listeners and the viewers and our audience who contribute and participate with this show on a regular basis will also send out their love and prayers and hold her dear as we go into these next couple of weeks, in the hope that this really does become the end of these difficulties that she's been having, and she will be able to get herself out of bed for a change and start walking around her house once more. So we lift her up in prayer, and that we do in earnest, diligently. Okay. Now,
Amen.
We do have
Amen.
A new member to our Roundtable team who I'd love to introduce to you this moment. And it was a very strange occurrence. Well, it wasn't strange indeed. It was spirit-filled and spirit-led. As we interviewed this individual a few weeks ago, her passion, her commitment, her sincerity, her honesty really touched me. And I was messaging TJ, we need to get her on the round table. And TJ was saying, but she's very busy. And all this was going on in the background. And she couldn't see because me and TJ was having this conversation off air while we were live on air. And TJ was saying to me, oh, well, I'll speak to her after show. And I was there, and she carried on talking for a bit longer. And I was just so encaptured in what was going on with the show and how she was representing herself and her beloved brother. I messaged TJ and I said, now, let's ask her now. Just ask her now. And TJ went, what, now? I went, yeah, now. And in the end, TJ just wasn't going to do it. So I just did it live in the middle of the interview and asked her if she would join us on the round table, and which she took the offer immediately and said that she'd be honoured to support and join us. And so, with no further ado, I want to introduce a new recruitee to the Roundtable team, and a very honourable one indeed, Stephanie Babb. How are we doing, Stephanie?
Hi, Kervin. Thank you so much. And that almost made me cry. Yeah, it was very spirit-filled, and I appreciate being here.
And, you know, we have a real tight family here. Jerry Summers sends his love and his blessings. He couldn't be with us today, but he's going to be back with us soon. He is still part of the Roundtable team, even though he's not been here for the last couple, but he's really caught up in something that he's working on at the minute. And he's very much a part of what we're doing going forward. So Jerry will be back with us shortly, and he messaged me yesterday to apologise for him not being here for the last couple of shows, but he will be back very shortly. He'll let us know as soon as he's free and he's able to do so. But we have got a very tight family here. So you guys want to welcome Stephanie to the Roundtable team?
Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am very honored to be here with you guys. I am incredibly excited about this.
Stephanie!
Hey.
We are incredibly excited to have you, Stephanie.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic that we have the format to be able to communicate and talk to each other and bring this to everybody else. If this had been something I could have tapped into 4.5 years ago, right after my brother was killed, it would have made a huge difference. And I'm hoping that all of us bringing what we have together and putting it out there are going to help all those other people. And hopefully it'll stop it from having to be so many people. So thank you guys.
Yes.
The most amazing thing is we have a perfect opportunity, a platform to raise these stories and keep these stories in the forefront of people's minds. And as long as we keep on doing that, something somewhere's got to give. Because the God that I serve is bigger than the world that operates around me. And I've got to believe that better must come, right must win over wrong, evil cannot be allowed to succeed. I've got to believe that, otherwise we're doomed. Why else could we have been put on this planet if it was just all meant to go pear-shaped and never go right? It's going to take decent people fighting for the right cause to see a change come in our lifetime. And we have a platform to do that. And as long as we're doing that diligently and we're doing it with a good heart and our motives are correct, God will honor that. I believe that 100%. God will honor that because our motive is correct. Our heart is right. And we're doing it for the right reasons.
So true.
Yes.
So I have been very specific in putting this team together, looking for the right sort of people that will complement one another. And so far, we've been able to accomplish that. While we're on that subject, there is one more person for the time being that we get. There is another person that I want, not another person, another role that I have, but I need to find the right person to fill it. But we do have one more that's going to be joining the very next roundtable, and that's Christina Bunch, who I interviewed last week. Wrongful convictions, exoneree, spent 17 years in prison, having been sentenced to 60 years for murder, 50 years for arson, for a crime that never happened. In fact, it was an accident. And what happened, if you guys wanted just a very quick refresh, was that after 2 hours after her 3-year-old child had died in an accidental fire, a police officer who was the first respondee decided that this was arson, and it was committed by somebody who was known to the family, and they never swayed from that investigation. They never looked at any facts, they never examined the evidence, they never looked at what was there, the forensics that was available to them. They just went on the fact that it was arson, and it must have been somebody known to the family who committed it. And within 5 to 6 days, Christine was charged with the murder and the arson, which was an horrific. She didn't actually have time to grieve for the loss of her 3-year-old child. And bearing in mind, by the time she went to court and she was found guilty and sentenced, she was actually pregnant, carrying another child. And the judge said that they felt that she only got pregnant so that the courts would feel sorry for her and give her a lighter sentence. Imagine that. She spent 17 years before the evidence uncovered that this was not an arson, it wasn't murder, but it was an electrical accidental fault which started in the ceiling of the house, which caused the fire. Totally contradictory to the evidence that the police brought forward at her trial and had her convicted. But when I heard her speak, and the fact that she was no longer speaking about her case, because for her case was done, she'd won, she was out, she was free, but she's now campaigning and advocating for other people who are wrongfully convicted, I felt that this was somebody that we needed to get on our roundtable team. And Christine Bunch will be joining us on the very next roundtable show. And so we look forward to welcoming her as we welcomed you today, Stephanie. Stephanie! I can't help it.
Hey!
Okay, so that's where we are at the moment. And what we're going to start the show off by doing is we're going to hand over to our dear friend Scott Russian, because he attended the adjudication of the investigation, or the well, he'll tell us what it is, but it's concerning the Desmond Phillips and the son of David Phillips, whom we did this show. In fact, the week before we did Scott Rushing's first show, we did David, and that's how I met Scott. I met Scott through David. And as it be, me and Scott has remained friends ever since. And he's an absolute tremendous member of the Roundtable team, who brings a very valued representation and experience to the team, and a voice of reason also. So let's hand over to you, Scott, and you can take us through what it was that you've been doing in the last week.
Well, I'd just rather hear you talk about me. That was awesome.
Well, I can do that a little bit more.
No. Gosh, just for the roundtable and our listeners, and I hope there's thousands and thousands out there. Until my son was killed 2 years ago, he was killed on July 23rd, 2017. I was blissfully ignorant of the justice, or now as I like to call it, the injustice system. And I'll just be honest with you, I'm not a poor, person of color. I'm a fairly well-to-do white man, as my wife and I are white. Our son was white, and I've come to learn that the racism. Oh, Kervin didn't ask me about this, and I'm veering off a little bit, but racism is a definite part of the system. It's shocking when you finally see it. And again, I was just ignorant, running my business and living in my world. And then you find out, really the difficult complications of poor people, people of color, people with mental illness, who are victims of the injustice system. And that sort of leads me into the David Phillips case. David is a brother of mine now. He happens to be a very modest but wonderful, powerful black man, and in Chico, California, which is a very non-homogeneous community. It's almost all white, and but they have friends there, members of their church, and David and his son Desmond, the victim, the deceased, were very close. Desmond had a mild retardation, some mental illness issues, and occasionally he would have episodes, not unlike, I'm sure all of you now have learned and know of, when someone's mentally ill, they do have occasional impairments, or their medicines don't work, or they don't take them, and things of that nature. And David and Desmond lived in a little apartment, and I've been to the apartment in Chico. It's you walk in the front door and you're practically in the backyard. And so Desmond and David were very close, did everything together, including feeding the poor. When they'd make sandwiches, these two, father and son, and feed the poor out of their church in Chico, and lived a very modest life. But Desmond had a mental health episode in the apartment one evening, March of 2017. My son was killed 4 months later. And several of the officers that were involved in killing Desmond Phillips, who was 25, were also involved in killing my son, who was 34, just 4.5 months apart. So that's another reason why, David and I have now bonded, and we're working together to try to get justice for Desmond and for Tyler. And on Tuesday, July 30th, there was a hearing I might get this not exactly right, I'm not an attorney, but it's called the Eastern District Court of California. It's a federal court, not a state court. And it was a hearing for a process called summary judgment, which is just a fancy phrase for a dismissal. And the Chico Police Department and the City of Chico attempted to present a case to the judge. This is done in a courtroom. The attorney for the City of Chico, the attorney for the Phillips family, and a judge were hearing, in effect, whether the case can move forward to a trial or will it be dismissed. The killing of Desmond is the case. And the trial was scheduled for November of this year. And I sat through the trial. The hearing Tuesday. I took careful notes. And my overarching theme, and I posted a couple of, maybe some of you have read some of my comments about the hearing. In my mind, Kervin and group, the judge, his name was John Mendez, had already made up his mind before the hearing. That's my major gripe and takeaway, that this judge, John Mendez, is known to be a pro-police judge. He's known by other civil rights groups and court watchers in Sacramento. And maybe Dee knows a little bit about this fellow. But I could tell, just sitting in the audience, after you go through security, and we're on the 14th floor of this beautiful, taxpayer-paid courthouse, in comes, the group supporting Desmond Phillips and David and I and his family and friends, and we had to go through security, and we get all of these warnings, admonitions, and so we're obeying all the rules. We go in, we sit quietly, and the judge starts the hearing, and he allows both attorneys, the Phillips attorney and the City of Chico attorney, to kind of make an opening statement. Then the judge goes into his presentation, and from the get-go, The judge was basically an advocate for the police department and an advocate for the city of Chico in being highly critical of the Phillips family attorney and the attorney's presentation of the case. And in effect, the judge found complete case for summary judgment, which means dismissal of the Phillips case. After, now it's been 2.5 years, and we finally get our first court hearing, we meaning the Phillips family with just me as a supporter. The judge, he just came down completely on the side of the police. No surprise, of course, to you in the Roundtable and our listeners. But I have to say it was pretty devastating when you actually see a federal judge in all these trappings, the robes, the bailiff with his gun, the clerks are typing away at their laptops, and up on the podium or up, on the judge's stand, he's pontificating down to the Phillips family and friends, saying the killing was justified. And these officers, the two in particular, their names were Fleer and Ganabin, and those names will come up because Officer Fleer tased my son after he was shot 3 times, lying face down in his own blood. My son was tased by Officer Fleer to see if he was still alive or dead. I used the taser for that on my son, not to disable my son or to get compliance, just to see if he would react to the taser. And Officer Fleer shot Desmond 9 times when he was laying down, 9 times. And another officer, Ganabin, shot 6 or 7 times. It's a little unclear. While Desmond Phillips was under the influence of a taser, they fired away. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But Judge Mendez, who'd heard all the evidence and heard this shocking, to me, killing on a mental health call, by the way. This was not like Desmond, attacking people. He was in his own home having a mental health episode. And David, the dad, did the right thing. He called mental health. He called 911 and said, my son needs help. Please send, paramedics, EMTs. He didn't say, come over and kill my son. He didn't say that. Nevertheless, the police show up, break into the house. They say Desmond resisted with knives. Turns out that was not the case. And even the judge admitted in court that the depositions of the officers were contradictory to the evidence. The officers said they thought Desmond had approached them with a knife. Turns out that it was not. It was part of the door jamb. It was the little striker plate on the door from the officers breaking the door in. That was the quote-unquote weapon that frightened these 2 officers that, in this dynamic situation, allowed them to fire away at poor Desmond, who was under the influence of a taser, and kill him right in front of David, his dad. But the judge said total, perfect, qualified immunity, that this killing of Desmond is the definition of qualified immunities. The officers did not have the time, according to the judge, to make a decision whether it was a piece of wood, whether it was a gun, whether it was a knife, that they had to protect themselves and David Phillips himself. And there were 2 children in another bedroom, David's grandkids, when Desmond was having this episode in the living room of this little apartment. So instead of just taking Desmond under power with just frankly jump on him or use pepper spray in his eyes or the ballistic shield to pin Desmond down and get him under control, the officers pulled their guns and fired away, blasted away. And Judge Mendez found for the city of Chico, for the police department, right down the line, did not give a wisp of sympathy or, credit to the Phillips family and the Phillips family attorneys. So, frankly, that is disheartening no matter what. I know the family's going to appeal. I know the attorney, his name is John Burris, is going to appeal this ruling, this summary judgment dismissal of Judge Mendez. But still, guys, when you hear it and you're sitting there in court and you followed all the rules and you've waited 2.5 years to have the judge just slam the case down and fine for the police in a heinous, killing, in my mind, on a mental health call, it's still pretty shocking. It just like knocks the wind out of everybody. So that's what happened Tuesday.
Here's the thing, Scott. The ruling stated, based upon the totality of the circumstances facing the involved Chico police officers, the use of force was reasonable, not excessive, and did not constitute negligence in the performance of their duties that evening. What does the judge mean by upon the totality of the circumstances facing the involved Chico police officers? What was it that they are claiming that they were confronted with that caused them to offload their gun 16 times?
Well, that's a good observation, and I hate phrases like, reasonable or unreasonable or totality. I mean, those are BS phrases. Pardon my, profanity there, but because those are just little legal traps to allow the judge to a lot of leeway to decide the totality. And his definition was the killing. It wasn't just officers blasting away in a panic shooting because their lives are threatened. It was that plus the fact that Desmond, according to the judge, had an opportunity to comply. Desmond had an opportunity to react to the taser in such a way that he wouldn't have been threatening to the officers. And therefore, because Desmond didn't comply, that Desmond was threatening to the officers had the right to use lethal force. So in the totality and the short period of time, what they call the exigent period, I love that word too, it's another BS word, exigent, which just means the officers rushed the killing of Desmond. In my mind, the exigency is the short period of time between the time they broke in to the time they killed him. I mean, it was just a matter of seconds. So instead of the judge saying the officers acted too quickly, the judge said it was such an exigent situation, the officers had no choice but to use their guns.
But because they reacted so quickly, they left themselves with little other option. Now,
that's correct.
Here's the thing.
Correct.
And guys, panel, feel free to come in whenever you feel like on this.
I'd actually like to jump in if you have a sec. Well, when you're ready, when you're done, I have something to say about
Okay, there was just one point that I wanted to make because I found this very pertinent with Andre Gladden. I found it very pertinent with Brian Babb. The mindset in which the police arrive at the situation determines their adrenaline rush in how they react and act on it, right? And for me, right, what's wrong with this picture? And sorry, Steph, I'm going to be very quick on this. What's wrong with this picture? If David Phillips has called the police because he's concerned about his son's well-being because he's not taking his medication and he's acting up, should the police not, and correct me if I'm wrong, should not the approach have been to arrive at the accommodation at the house, call David Phillips out and say, right, you've called us, what's going on here? What normally happens now? What's the worst that your son is likely to do? How best can we go in there and resolve this? Is your son susceptible to this type of approach? Is he likely to respond to you, or is he going to respond to authority? What's wrong with trying to do some field research before you go in there and pull your gun out of the holster? Because I'm not getting any of this. We're coming across people who are struggling with mental health related issues, which tells me that these guys are having intrusive thoughts. Do you guys understand what that is? Because most people that struggle with paranoia or schizophrenia, right, will have intrusive thoughts. And those intrusive thoughts are not controlled by themselves, right? So while somebody is having intrusive thoughts, the family member that normally deals with that individual will have an idea how they normally bring about some kind of peace, calmness, how they break it down. Even in the midst of, do you normally just leave him to a corner by himself until he winds down? How do you get him to take his meds eventually? What normally happens? What's the worst that he's ever done? So that we can really gauge, how do we approach this? Because If all they're ever going to do is walk into a building with gun-ho with their guns out of the holster, tasers and guns blazing in order to bring, then man, you might as well lock up every single mental health related individual and shoot them now.
Right, exactly. But they're not going to do that because then they lose the opportunity to be a cowboy. They're not going to approach it that way.
Okay,
they wouldn't approach it that way unless it was somebody that they are related to, somebody that they value.
And that there lies the problem, Yolanda. Because if that officer was going to a house that was a family member, that was somebody that he knew, that somebody was close to, somebody he had a relationship with, they would have approached it differently. So how could they then use, based upon the totality of the circumstance facing the involved Chico police officers, the use of force was reasonable, not excessive, and did not constitute negligence in the performance of their duties that evening. The negligence was the way that they approached the situation in the first place.
Yes.
Can I address something?
Come in, Steph.
I think that's why. Okay, that's why we need a new call center. We need another number for people who have family members in a mental distress state to be able to call and have them respond. Police are not educated. They're not trained to deal with this. They're not trained to de-escalate the situation and to deal with a mental health situation. When the majority of what goes on in the world, when they're responding to those kinds of calls, that's exactly what they're responding to. I think if we had that changed, and then secondary, if they needed the force, they could call the police. But the first thing that should happen is that we would have another number that we could call for people to respond to these individuals, our family members that need help in the moment. And then I want to jump back really quick. We had summary judgment a couple of months ago, and it was in the form of an oral argument after the complaints and the response to the complaints. And each section takes like 30 days. You have to respond. The judge goes over everything. So he called for an oral argument, which means we all get in the courtroom, just like you were saying, Scott, and it is very intense. It is the slightest nuance of sound, of emotion, of gesture. It's very, how's the word, hyper focused on everything. Our experience was the judge ruled in our favor for summary judgment. And so he said we could move to trial, which we were all excited. We thought that was great. We were waiting for a trial date. And then we were told that we were only set to go to the next section, which means another judge, another federal judge in kind of a different jurisdiction, and I don't know exactly what that is, was to go over everything and then decide. So only 3 weeks ago, we had Judge McShane take over the summary judgment that ruled in our favor from Judge Coffin in Lane County in Eugene, Oregon, and give us, again, decide in our favor and set a trial date, which is huge. This is 4.5 years after the fact, and our trial date's for February 18th of 2020, and that is roughly a month to the 5-year date of when my brother was killed. 5 years. Yeah, five years. We've been doing this. Oh boy, there's anyway, the time management, you mentioned that too. What the response that your judge said is in the moment of time that they have to make that split decision, and then you come into the de-escalation and everything else. And this really does come down to time management. And when you look at what really works, the solutions, when we have somebody that can come and respond to people who need de-escalation, somebody that can deal with mental health issues, somebody in distress in the moment, that takes time. And that doesn't rack up the amount of convictions and arrests that they're out to get. It's a job. They clock in, they clock out. They're not dealing, that's not what they want to do, at least the way I see it. And so I think if we had a different kind of call center, different kind of dispatch, it would be the solution. And it just boggles my mind that we keep passing over what can really work. And having said that, everything that you've just gone through is amazing. And my heart's really out to you. I'm so sorry that they dismissed that. That's not fair.
Now, is it? Are we surprised in the rise of mental health related cases where innocents are being shot and killed with police reactions? Are we surprised?
No, not at all.
I am definitely not surprised. Definitely not surprised. There seems to be this that nobody wants to really mention or emphasize on the fact that everything is happening now that is supposed to happen according to the agenda. And that's why we are not seeing convictions, only to a selected few, and that's far in between. I feel like I always have to go down to the basics, and I keep hearing the training. That just completely, causes my head to explode, because yet again, Kervin, you are not in law enforcement, and you have the mind, heart, and wisdom to acknowledge what is wrong and what is right. In law enforcement, there's a whole bunch of criteria that needs to be passed, and there's evaluation. This stuff is seen by law enforcement and those in power to place the decision whether this is a credible officer or not, and with what intention he comes with. We can see that. People can see that. If I can tell the difference between an orange tree and a grapevine. Go ahead.
Sorry, Dee. I want to point out that qualified immunity actually has a prejudice. So when you go into a courtroom, say you've gotten a speeding ticket and a cop comes
that's
in
obvious.
And speeds,
that is obvious.
Yeah, it's law that they have the prejudice, that they are sworn to uphold the law. So when you go into a courtroom, a cop's word, a police officer's word already has more power and more pull behind it than anything or any evidence you have to offer. It's ruled in their favor, their opinion, their experience.
Right.
There's something wrong with that. Yeah.
Yeah, the officer of the herd. So it's mentally ill people are looked at as unfixable. So they're throwaway people. And this is just them helping out the system.
That just breaks my heart.
That's why we get judges that are don't have any kind of empathy towards the families, and they just look at it as, well, they're just a problem. They're just a strain on the state. You got to keep paying for all this medication and treatment for them. So
exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
Now the family is alleviated of having to worry about that loved one. You're not doing anybody a favor, but that's how they look at it. But I'm gonna tell you one thing that we need to look at is the records and the history of these judges to see whether or not they consistently dismiss cases, if they consistently allow officers to run free and rampant. If that's the case, these are the people that we need to go after and get them removed from the bench. Sometimes you got to send a message from the head to the tail instead of the tail to the head.
Have any of you heard of Position Statement 59?
No.
Okay, can I read Position Statement 59 to you? And it's the official policy in responding to behavioral health crisis. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. The policy. People with serious and untreated mental health and substance use conditions often encounter barriers that prevent receiving the right services. The absence of appropriate services causes many harms, including mental health and substance use crisis. Unfortunately, we do not have appropriate systems in place to respond to mental health and substance use crisis. Among the widespread problems are the lack of alternatives to calling 911, the lack of training for 911 personnel, the lack of alternative to dispatching law enforcement personnel in response to mental health and substance use crisis, the lack of training for law enforcement personnel, and the lack of crisis and respite services with the expertise to manage mental health and substance use conditions in a manner that facilitates recovery and reduces hospitalization, involvement in the criminal justice system, and homelessness. Now, here's my question, and I've got another part to read after this. If they've already acknowledge this as being a serious problem in their reaction and response to people going through behavioral health crisis, why aren't they doing anything about it?
Because it doesn't give them money. The system needs money. That's what it's set up on. So if a cop has so many convictions, they're given a quota they need to fill. And so however many tickets, arrests, anything else. So when people come in, you pay for everything. It keeps the economy going. And then it feeds into the prisons. And there's a lot of it that just relies on money. Because like I said, the solution, you look at the Memphis example, they have a mental health crisis response team. They've been doing it for 20 years. Their success rate is so phenomenal. The statistics are amazing that it works, and it's so simple, and it's a solution, but they're not getting the arrests because what they're doing works. That means there's a lack of revenue coming in.
So watch this. Further to that additional policy, as a result, persons experiencing mental health or substance use crisis may, and here's the following, end up in confrontations with law enforcement personnel which have tragic outcomes, be transported to emergency rooms and be admitted or committed to inpatient psychiatric facilities when these outcomes are unnecessary and may be harmful to the person, and be transported to a jail and subjected to ongoing involvement in the criminal justice system when these outcomes are unnecessary, are harmful to the person, and do not lead to increased public safety. What are your views on that?
There's something else I want to point out is, people that have somebody who is in a mental health crisis, I've talked to many families where somebody is in a psychotic break, they're having an episode, and their only recourse is to actually call the police. They've taken them into the hospital. The hospital can't commit them if they're over 18, so they can't put them in a safe place for the moment. And so they're taken, the person with the issue is taken home, and the police are then called. So the police can make that judgment call. So the family has to really rely on the police officers to do that for them. In the meantime, you have that gap where they come in and you have somebody in a psychotic episode and they're acting out in the ways that we would expect them to. And then the cops respond the way that the system doesn't work. And that's...
Right.
Yeah.
That's the overarching theme, Curvin, is the system does not work. And Yolanda, I think, said it. If the officers are arriving, they're trained to shoot. Let's face it, guys. At the academies, through their peers, their ongoing training, 90% of it is how to shoot a guy, how to choke a guy, how to knock a guy down with jujitsu. It's not, Curvin.
It has nothing to do with life preservation whatsoever.
Exactly.
So
it's really crime fighting. It's really not crime fighting.
So here's the thing. If I'm confronted by my teenage to adult child who's doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and I approach them with a correctional attitude, in other words, don't do this or else, stop doing this or you're going to leave my house, I expect them to understand that I mean what I say, right? And if they don't, then I'll carry out the appropriate action. The threat that I've just made, I will carry it out because they are at a standard, at a level that they can comprehend and understand what I've just said to them and know the difference between right and wrong. Please don't come in my house smoking marijuana. Don't go in my toilet and inject heroin. Don't come in here and with your drunk friends and start urinating all over my living room. If I tell you not to do these things as an adult, I'd expect you to be able to understand, comprehend, and if you don't, I will carry out the threat of putting you out of my house, even if that means that me and you fall out. Right? Okay.
Correct.
1. But my 18-month daughter starts reaching up for the pot that's on the fire. Do I take the belt or the stick and whack her across the head because I've told her 5 times, 10 times not to reach for the pot because it's got hot water in it? Do I boot her across my kitchen floor, right, because it's about the 30th time that I've caught her trying to reach for it, right, and I haven't got the time to keep getting off my settee and going back and telling her not to do it again? Do I just take a gun or an Uzi and obliterate her? Call the police and have her arrested because at 18 months, I'm tired of telling her not to reach for the hot pot that's on the cooker, that she probably can't reach anyway because she's too short to reach it. But because she's not doing what I've told her not to do, she's going to face the maximum consequence. Because for me, that is a type of ridiculous mentality law enforcement officers are going into, right, when they are dealing with situations which differ in their circumstance, but they are not emotive enough to respond to the difference that they are encountering. You go into a community and you've got a gangbanger, a rapist, a murderer, a bank robber who will do anything to stay alive and not be caught by the police. In other words, he's dead ready to shoot anybody that gets in his way. I can understand that guy getting 15 bullets before he goes down. But you are called to the home of a family whose child, son, or daughter are in crisis. Mental health crisis. They're not criminals. They've not just robbed a bank. They haven't just molested a 3-year-old child. They haven't just raped an 80-year-old woman. They are in mental health crisis. They've not taken their meds today, or they haven't taken their meds for 2 or 3 days, and now they're acting up because they haven't taken their meds. They're behaving in an inappropriate way. They're getting a little bit aggressive. They're getting a little bit difficult for us to handle. They're getting noisy around the house, and they're not doing as they're told. Does that call for an execution?
No.
Absolutely not.
But that's the way. That's the way they are being approached.
Absolutely. So
and there's another.
Go on, Steph. Go on, Steph.
There's something else here too. Is that I hear from a lot of families about this kind of thing, and a lot of these cases get brought to my attention. And one of the things that I've come across is there's a lot of families who have an individual with mental health issues. They've been arrested repeatedly. They've been in trouble. And if they do get killed, they're in that circumstance, there's this shame attached to it. And they, instead of going, wait a minute, the cop didn't, that shouldn't have happened, they back away because they're being told, that's the person, that caused the problem and everything else. They're not looking at the fact that shouldn't have happened, because this is really organic. This is something that we're just beginning to look at as a country, as humans, like that. This is something we don't turn a different color. We talk everything else. But mental illness is really hard to identify. Are they just acting out? Are they drunk? This kind of thing. So there's that shame that's involved with these families coming forward and speaking out for what's happened to their family members. And again, I believe it's because our system is set up so horribly that we just accept it for what it is. And it comes back again to like what Scott said at the very, very beginning, which is seeing and realizing what is really happening, the layers that are going on here when cops come and respond to these kind of calls with our family members who need help. They're no different than anybody else. We need to be better. We need to do better by these people and respond to them accordingly, because this doesn't work. You don't get to come back from being dead. That's it.
And you just hit the nail on the head. They don't come back from being dead. You can't say sorry to a dead person. They can't hear you, right? And here's the thing. There are few people, and I just want to ask you guys a question, and anybody can answer. You can all answer. Have you ever heard of something that they refer to as dual diagnosis?
Correct, yes.
So dual diagnosis is where mental health meets drug addiction, right? Because the medical authorities find it difficult to interpret which one's which when somebody is acting out sometimes, because some of the behavioral patterns are similar. So
you're right.
Here in the UK, when we encounter dual diagnosis, we treat it as mental health, unless we have evidence to prove otherwise.
Yeah. I used to work in a
and the reason is because whatever you're going to use to alter the mood of the individual would be the same. Because drugs is a mood alterer. Right?
Well, the symptoms come out. The symptoms look exactly the same. I worked in a lockdown psychiatric
absolutely
unit. And so you'd stabilize the individual and make sure that they weren't on any substances, and then you were able to diagnose what the behaviors were and then treat accordingly. But getting them into a place like that, we're just not set up as a system to do that.
So the bottom line is, if at the very worst that you needed to restrain someone because they were acting out on either their medication, lack of medication, or drug addiction, right? Then there is no need to even draw your weapon, because that should not become necessary ever unless the individual themselves is reaching for a weapon. Now, 9 times, I've never encountered any of these cases that we're talking about where they are trying to restrain somebody and that individual is reaching for a weapon. The most that we've ever heard, the most that has ever been presented as evidence, is the person has been resisting the restraining.
Now, reacting.
Yeah, non-compliant.
But non-compliant at the very worst. You've never seen somebody, reaching down in it. I know they've claimed that and they've planted weapons on people in the past, but what we were referring to is there is no evidential support to an individual going through a mental health crisis reaching for a weapon. So why are officers going gung-ho with their weapons drawn? And that goes back to Andre, it goes back to Brian Babb, it goes back to some of the many other Desmond, it goes back to all of these other people that we've been interviewing, family members here on this show. Especially this year, the number of mental health related cases that we've dealt with. It goes back to the attitude and mindset that the officers were responding to prior to them arriving at the scene. And we talked about that extensively with Dee when we were talking about Andre Gladden, right? The way that the call might have been made out, the 911 call. We've told her to try and find out what the 911 tape sounds like, and more importantly, what was the call from the 911 or from the dispatch to the officers, right? So that we can try and ascertain what was the officers actually told. Why did they arrive there with the mindset that this is how they had to approach it? Because for me, if somebody is called, if you call 911 because that's what you have to do, and you are explaining that this is your child, surely, even in that statement itself, the police would know that a father is not calling for you to come and execute his child. He's asking for help. He's asking for help.
Let me interrupt a little. That was my, you all agree with me, but that was my overarching opinion when David Phillips called me when he heard my son had been killed by some of the same officers that killed Desmond. David called me and told me his story, and the overarching opinion is it makes no sense to me that a loving father who, because he loves his son, he sees his son in distress. The father's not worried about himself. The father's worried about his child. And he calls 911 as any responsible parent would do and says, on a mental health call, I need help. My son might hurt himself. My son might hurt me. There's other people here, but I'm worried for my son. Yeah. And then within a few minutes, the police come. They break in because, the impaired person cannot comply. He's not in a mental state to comply. And a few seconds later, that
It's all over.
loved one on a mental health call, the parent expected a rescue. He gets 17 bullets in his face, neck, and head. And it's just so shocking to me, being, again, ignorant of the world and of the facts at that time, that I was just sickened by the whole thing, the whole story. And now after 2 years, and because of your group, now I've realized it's a pattern. The officers not being trained, they're being trained to shoot, not to de-escalate. The pattern of these mental killings of mentally ill is a pattern. They would prefer to shoot rather than to, Curvin, as you said, make a plan to detain this person. And again, these killings, you see the pattern. They're not gun battles. They are just that mentally ill person is not able to comply. But they're not gun battles, yet they end up killed. And it just gobsmacks me. I'm dumbfounded that the system can't see that. And it's not even cost effective. I mean, I'm a businessman, and when you kill people, when you violate the relationship between the father and the son, and this family's life is turned upside down, it's not even efficient. The efficient thing to do would be to help that child get mental health and patch his family back together, rather than to kill that mentally ill person. And you know, as you said, sometimes it's not mental illness. It could be alcohol. It could be a food allergy. It could be anything unusual that could result in a killing. So these officers, they just have to quit killing people. Simply quit shooting. Start being peace officers. And I'll leave it at that.
Here's the thing. You know, sometimes I see it in movies, so I would imagine it's something that the police do. You know, when they sat down in this room and they've got this, you know, these whiteboards up on the wall, and they're talking about, yeah, we're going to go and do a raid here. So, you know, Team A, you're going to go in that way, and Team B, you're going to go in that way, and who have we got on the ground, and who have we got as a communicator, and the reform that we should be looking at is that this should be stopped. This police response, gun-ho mentality to a mental health related issue needs to be stopped, and it needs to be a planned raid on this house, so to speak. So you sit people down, right? We've just had a call. We need to go now. Who have we got on the ground? Right? Okay. Well, the guy's father just called. He was the caller. So do we know where he is? Yes. He's at the address. Oh no, he's not at the address. Okay. Can we get him to the address? Right? Can somebody pick him up on the way? Right? What else do we know? Right? Has this guy got a doctor? Has this guy got a counselor? Can we get hold of them? And let's get these boots on the ground. Let's get them there. Right? So then when we approach, we can try and talk this guy out first before we go in with any form of other plan. So what's plan B? Right, okay, so father can't talk him out, counselor can't talk him out. Then we're going to have to go in from the front and the back and try and restrain him as quickly as possible. Do we know the layout of the house? No. Okay, let's get a layout of the house. Get the father on the phone. Let's get an understanding of where the guy might be, the person might be, and what we might have to do to get in. Now, I'm not a brain surgeon, and I'm not a police sergeant or an expert. But these to me would sound like common sense measures if you're going to try and deal with a situation where A, it's not life threatening, and B, this guy is not a criminal. What you're trying to do is contain a situation and bring it about to a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, rescue someone in distress.
And that's just off the top of my head. Imagine what we can come up with if we sat down with real strategic plans with mental health as professionals who would advise us best how to go in and approach somebody going through a mental health crisis. Now, how would that have looked, for example, Stephanie, with Brian, for example? How would that approach have changed the outcome to what happened to Brian?
It would have changed. Well, he'd still be here, to be honest. So Brian's Brian was on the phone with his VA therapist, and he was on 100% disability for PTSD and traumatic brain injury. He was in a mental health crisis. He knew that. He knew what to do. Like Andre Gladden went into the hospital. People know what's going on, and they look for help. There's just not a viable solution that's going to get the help they need in a crisis situation like that. So when the VA therapist, Becky Higgins, her only alternative was to call the police to do a well check on my brother. So when the information was passed to, she called 911, and I'd gone over this in the last podcast, then there was a shift change. So many different elements of communications were lost. And what they ended up hearing was there's a veteran that had a gun out earlier. That's the only thing they'd heard. It was locked away and put away. He had been telling it. He just wanted to hear the sound. It wasn't even to shoot himself. He wanted to recreate the sound. It was some PTSD stuff. So these cops came at him with a SWAT team. How does that, to me, that doesn't compute. How do you respond to somebody in a mental health crisis with a gun when what they need is somebody who's educated, who can deal and de-escalate and assess the situation in the moment? We need a new call center. I mean, we came up with 911. Why can't we come up with another emergency dispatch for a team to specifically respond to these situations? What would that look like?
We do have a sorry, Steph. We do have a lot of noise in the background. I'm not sure who that is. It's only Stephanie or Scott, because you two are the only two guys who got your mics on.
Okay, might be me. So
that's okay. Well,
can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you. There's a lot of crunching going on. Are you eating, Scott?
No.
It sounds like it sounds like you're walking in snow or something.
Well, I am moving a little bit, so I apologize.
Okay, so yeah, I get you, Steph. So go ahead, Steph.
So if we had a team like they do for domestic violence calls, there's a specialized task force. In the 80s, more police were killed responding to domestic violence calls than all other calls combined. So they came up with this wonderful idea of having a specialized task force that responds specifically to domestic violence calls. Guess what? It works. So why aren't we expanding this and getting a more specialized thing? The blanket call to 911 and expecting our loved ones to get responded to from people with guns that just, their whole agenda is it's time management. Again, get them arrested, take care of them, put them away, get them where they need to go. That's not what Brian needed. Brian needed a moment. We have something in Eugene here called Cahoots, and that's what they are. They're a mobile response team to people in emotional crises, people who have drank too much, that kind of thing. And they're amazing. And they showed up that day to my brother's house, and they weren't allowed to address him. Their whole system is set up to deal with people in a mental health crisis. And they were told they couldn't approach my brother because my brother had access to guns. He had a safe in the living room. His roommate had already come out. My brother had been on the phone with his VA therapist. He was talking. He joked with her. He knew that he was in a crisis, like Andre knew. Andre went to the hospital and said, hey, I need, my medication looked at, whether he was having delusions or, they know how to recognize the symptoms that are coming through. And it's all about management and medication management and behavioral management and that kind of thing. So they know, and that's all we need. That's all the information we need to be able to put something else together. So why isn't it happening? Why don't we have that in place? Do we need to, if cops were getting killed, would we then have a specialized task force? What is it going to take for us to step up and do something that works?
Amen. Let me just bring in D. Martin a minute. When you're looking at this response that we're talking about, if it had been Andre, for example, sorry, D, just 1 minute. If we were talking about Andre, for example, what we do know is that Andre had already got some kind of a relationship with the guy whose doorstep he was on. If you had an experienced negotiator or an experienced officer, they would have been able to advise the guy that was at the door that he was being supported by them. Could he not be that familiar voice that Andre needed to hear in hoping bringing about a peaceful resolution to the fear that Andre was feeling at that moment in time? And had they approached that differently, rather than enforcing the alienation that Andre must have felt in order to be desperate enough to try and reach inside the house, do you think that there would have been a different outcome for Andre if the planning, strategic planning of trying to come in there with a different approach? What do you think the outcome could have been? Would you think it would have been more helpful for him?
Oh, it would have been life-saving for him, definitely. Like I said, as we stated, the contents of the call, we don't know. However, they the way that they approached the situation is as if they had no idea what was happening, as if they just stumbled across without a call. Without any sort of notification information about what they were walking into. That was the way in which they approached the situation. Had someone came with skill that would have been able to assess the situation and actually have a conversation with him, as it was clear and apparent, he was able to have dialogue with both the officer, which he did not believe that's who he was, as well as Desmond. If Desmond was able to have a conversation with Andre stating what the issues was, what's happening, and what he needed, it's obvious he would have been able to have that conversation with law enforcement, regardless of his intelligence. So it definitely would have been helpful, life-saving.
You know, as I'm beginning to listen to these arguments that we're presenting here today, Yolanda wanted to talk about overkill and should there be stiffer penalties. But in the introduction and in the promo, we talked about people being shot 10 or 20 or 30 times. But if you are somebody struggling with mental health related issues, being shot once is an overkill because it's unnecessary.
Exactly.
It's an unnecessary reaction to an issue that can be resolved in a different way. So let's start at that point. For example, let's bring in Yolanda if we can, and get her to bring out her theory on overkill and the reason why she wanted to bring that into today's roundtable. Hi, Yolanda.
Hey, yeah, and you're right. One bullet is overkill. Especially when you're dealing with a person in a mental crisis, when you're not exercising any other option. You know, this isn't the Wild Wild West where you shoot first and then ask questions later. But we have more and more of these incidents where people are shot multiple times. Officers are unloading their guns and reloading and unloading again. There should be some sort of penalty that they have to suffer for that. And to me, it really doesn't matter if the person is actually presenting some sort of threat to their life, because once they're down, they're down. There's no reason to unload your gun unless they're wearing a bulletproof vest and you're a lousy shot. So there should be some sort of penalty other than just losing your job for when an officer does that to someone. I mean, I know of too many people who couldn't even have an open casket funeral and opted for cremation because the person is so riddled with bullets, there's no way to repair them enough to be by the public. You know?
And I just want to interject with Andre's case. In my opinion, there was no need to use lethal force at all. Given Andre's strength, he is a strong man, but he was and still is legally blind. He could have been hit with anything and would have been taken down. He wouldn't have saw where it was coming from. So the need to use excessive lethal, deadly force was beyond me.
Absolutely.
It was not necessary at all.
And we have to acknowledge the fact that the excessive force isn't just bullets. It's tasers, batons, their fists. Anytime they go to the excess, it should be a penalty for it. You know, they should serve some time. And I say the minimum is 2 years, the very minimum. And nobody should get 2 years off the bat.
And here's the thing, excessive force or overkill ain't just necessarily about whether or not a person is innocent. Overkill is whether they're guilty or not, because if you're using overkill or excessive force and you've already restrained somebody, you need to be punishable by law. And so let's just go to Scott for a minute, because Tyler, I believe, that was an overkill, excessive force.
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
I had to go off for a minute. Okay.
That's fine.
The case of Tyler, you know, as some of you recall, he was initially shot by, he was accused of breaking into a commercial building about 11 p.m. at night, closed commercial building, to steal whatever he was alleged to be stealing. There's no money. It was an office building, so no hostages, no money. But it was the alarm that was tripped in the building that led the security guard, who is a 23-year-old security guard. And in California, guards are allowed to be armed. They take an 8-hour course, and they're allowed to carry, 9mm Glocks with hollow point bullets after an 8-hour course. And this 23-year-old showed up at this building on the alarm to check out what could have been even a false alarm, and pulls his gun out and goes through bushes, underneath a chain link fence to get onto a patio, where he confronts my son, shoots my son through the chest. Then my son went into the building that he was allegedly burgling, went to the bathroom, tried to get himself first aid, and he was shot right above the left nipple, where you would hold your hand over your heart it was shot right there with a hollow point bullet, 1 inch away from a Glock, 1 inch away from his chest. So he had tremendous damage, and went into the bathroom, obviously in blood loss, and you would have to assume shock. My son had no criminal record. He wasn't a veteran of combat. He was a festival grip. He did electrical and lighting and staging for music festivals, so he was far removed from the criminal world. And so he didn't, I'm sure, know how to react. And he was in that bathroom when the police came, and he locked himself in the bathroom. I'm sure he was scared. They're not even sure if he locked himself in or not, but the officer that ended up putting a bullet through my son's throat and a bullet in the back of my son's head was the sergeant in charge of the SWAT team. And as sergeant in charge, attempted to negotiate with my son for a few minutes through the door, didn't really have a conversation. Then the sergeant personally grabbed a ram, broke the door open, and then in the scuffle, had a dog go in, was biting my son, let me say, below the waist. I'll be nice. And I don't know many men or women that could be compliant with the dog, the canine, drooling, barking, biting you below the waist. So my son was non-compliant, obviously. And there is film of this, which I have seen on body-worn cameras. It's pretty horrific. And then they shoot my son. The sergeant gets pissed off. He pulls out his gun. He puts his gun to my son's chest, pulls the trigger. It hit him through his Adam's apple. And then my son gets a second shot in the back of his head, which the sergeant says my son was still a threat to the officer, even though the shot went through the back of my son's head and exited through his jaw. And I saw my son's body. It's a horrible thing. Last time I saw him was in the morgue. And it was, I saw these wounds, and just given it's such a, that's shocking enough, and and disturbing enough. And the stories, really I was lied to, frankly, by the DA. The officers had time to get, their story together, to say my son was a violent burglar, and their lives were threatened. I think the capper to all that is the officer that tased my son is Officer Fleer. That name will come up again because he's the officer that shot Desmond 9 times, mostly in the head, face, and neck. Officer Fleer tased my son when he was lying face down in the blood, and I've seen this, to see if he was alive or not. And a taser is supposed to be used for compliance to an unruly, by any training or policy procedure, Kervin and team. A taser is not supposed to be used to see, well, let's just tase him, see what the hell happens. I exaggerated that part of it, but it's very clear by deposition and by the body-worn cameras that the Officer Fleer, since he didn't get to shoot Tyler, he decided he wanted to tase him just to see what would happen. So there's my son who's clinging to life. If he had any life left, we don't know. But when you get 50,000 volts and you're lying down, face down in your own blood, that is pretty heinous and pretty excessive use of force, and unreasonable and sadistic too. But clinically, I think it's just unreasonable use of force. Yet the district attorney, in his wisdom, after justifying 32 other killings, felt that the officers, all of them, used reasonable force, and the guard also used reasonable force in killing my son. And think about it, a guard is not a government employee, he's not a police officer, he's a private 23-year-old, wannabe cop that was using his guard experience as an entree into law enforcement. And, he pulls his gun out and goes into a building. I mean, that could happen to any of us today at our homes. If you have an alarm at your home and you accidentally set it off, I've done it. And I've had to call the alarm company and go, it was me, don't send the police. It was me. If any of you did that, you wonder for a moment, will the cops be at my door? And if in that area of Chico, California, Northern California, it's such a gung-ho, cowboy, trigger-happy police department, when they show up at a building, they show up guns out. They don't show up these are guards. These are not police even. These are guards. And that's what the DA allows these people to do. And the DA extended a justified killing to a private guard who's not a government employee. So it's pretty rank, pretty stinky. And it doesn't pass the smell test when the DA justifies a killing of any type like this. And then the excessive force, as you say, the overkill, using a taser just to see what, someone lying face down in their blood will do. It's pretty sadistic, pretty sick, yet justified by the DA. We'll see. We'll be going to our summary judgment trial probably next year. I'm sure that the defendants will try to dismiss the case as they did with Desmond Hills, as they did in Stephanie's case. But the real issue we're talking about is this unreasonable use of force and the overkill. My son needed a rescuing after he got shot by a panicky guard, and Desmond needed rescuing. Stephanie's brother needed help. He didn't need bullets. But you see this pattern, Andre. You see the pattern again and again and again. So yes, and I think every bullet should be justified. If they shoot once, if they shoot 10 times, the officer has to justify every time he pulled the trigger.
Amen.
I can tell you, no judge will go with that. The judge, I heard Judge Mendez say, these officers had the right to fire away at Desmond completely. They could empty their guns on Desmond. The judge would have found that totally justified, full qualified immunity, because that is the current law, probably nationwide, if not in California.
And once again, the ruling stated, based upon the totality of the circumstances facing the involved Chico police officers, the use of force was reasonable, not excessive, and did not constitute negligence in the performance of their duties that evening. How does that last statement, did not constitute negligence in the performance of their duties that evening, how does that measure up against the qualified immunity, which also acts as a almost double protection barrier?
Correct. Yeah, it's just obscene, really. It's just obscene. And as I said, I think every single strike with a baton. Every single bullet needs to be accounted for, so that these officers will have to explain, why they kept shooting, why they kept hitting, why they kept kicking. Just simple pepper spray, for example, in the case of Desmond or Tyler, had the and they carry pepper spray. It's not a decoration. It's a tool. Had they sprayed Desmond in the eyes with pepper spray, or Tyler in the eyes, they might flail around Curvin, but they couldn't hit anybody. That pepper spray it takes your breath away. I've tested it on myself with a friend who's a police officer. I had him squirt me, and it knocks you flat. You can't breathe, you can't see. And had they just done that with Tyler or Desmond, they'd both be alive today. But they don't want to do that, as Yolanda said. They want to pull out their guns and play cowboys. And that's just got to stop. That's the message we have to get out.
Patrick, you've been very quiet for most of the show, as you may well have probably felt that a lot of this wasn't for you directly. I don't know. But what has been your opinions while you've been listening through, as we've talked about, the overkill, qualified immunity, and the excessive force that's been used, and the ruling, the baby ruling that was given on Desmond Phillips in particular?
I'm absolutely riveted by some of the descriptions of the accounts. First of all, I want to say, Scott, I had not heard about Tyler being tased after he was killed, and when you mentioned that today, it just created a pit in my stomach that my heart goes out to you. But I'm so thankful, and so I admire so much that you have joined forces with David Phillips in seeking justice, and I'm just absolutely heartbroken over these descriptions that I've heard. But here's the thing: is that these people that we've talked about are just a fraction of many more thousands. We have Jamarian Robinson out of Georgia. He was shot 76 times. 76 times. 76 times. Said his arms and his head were shot off of his body. Now, when we lose someone through something like this, it's already a scene from the Twilight Zone for the families. But can you imagine if you have a loved one who was shot 76 times? We have Willie McCoy out of California who was shot 25 times.
Yes.
Sleeping in his car. We just had a woman in Arlington, Texas, just a few days ago that was shot by a cop that had just started being a cop on July 1st, killed this woman shooting at a dog in Arlington, Texas, a few days ago. So these examples that we're seeing, we can even go deeper than that. We have, and since 2017, we have 416 people have been killed just in police car chases. Innocent people. Just check out this figure. 13,100 people killed in police car chases since 1979 to 2017. 13,100 innocent people killed because of the negligence of police. And so I think we have to ask ourselves these questions. How is it happening, and why is it happening? And I think Stephanie nailed it when she said it's about profit. We know that our jails and our prisons are occupied, have become the new mental health asylums and hospitals. They house the majority of them are mental health patients, is what the stats are telling us. So people and the drive for profit is this: they have jails to keep full. And this is what's important to them. They have private prisons that they have to keep at a certain occupancy. And so when you don't have, in lieu of real criminals, then you go out and you grab anybody. And so we're getting a lot of mental health people that are populating our jails and our prisons. The thing about it is that when we talk about overkill, as it's been stated, one shot is overkill. I mean, because once a loved one is dead, they're gone. But to deal with the added horror of a person who's been shot and so heinously killed, such as Tyler and a lot of these others, Mr. Gladden. It just really, what it alerts me to is that we have some total failures in our systems. We have this in training. We have failures in training. We had Jerry talk to us a couple of months ago that they're given 6 hours of mental health crisis training, and that's it. And my position is this: is that if you go to an academy and you're taught that you're a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Whatever situation you're in, it's a nail, right? And so we have that, and then we have failures in our justice system, or as Scott correctly calls them, our injustice system. We have DAs and judges and officers that are working together, working together against the citizens that they are sworn to protect. So I think the problem of this is manifold and is definitely worthy, extremely worthy of conversation. I'm riveted, and even with Taylor, who wasn't a mental health crisis, but he was shot 5 times while he sat unarmed in his car, and so that's overkill to me. The story that I just heard from Scott about Tyler it has really upset me in a way, just to imagine those moments. And I'm sorry, Scott, but once again, I'm so encouraged and uplifted by you great people who have turned your pain into power and are working now to change things. So my heart goes out to you, and I'm just absolutely mortified and horrified by what I'm hearing.
I don't think people. Yeah.
No, go on, Steph.
Yeah, I know. I'm kind of taken aback too. It's very emotional. I was sent a video the night before last, and it was taken by witnesses. And I'm not going to add names or anything else because it's so recent. It was sent to me because I usually know kind of how to resource stuff, but the witnesses were videotaping somebody who had just been shot, and it was a response to a mental health crisis. And one of the things the witnesses said in the video was, why'd they shoot him 3 times in the back? He was running away. He was scared. It's a very graphic video, but it comes back to people distance themselves and detach. And when you start to hear these stories and you realize what the families have to face, that's when reality really hits. And that's what people need to hear. And so I want to honor everyone that speaks up and tells their truth, because that's what's going to get people to hear what needs to be changed. And that's what we're doing here. But yeah.
Absolutely. Spot on.
Yes.
So we've spoken about the overkill. We've spoken about the excessive force. We spoke about the initial case that we talked about with Desmond Phillips and the adjudication and the outcome of that particular thing. And the one thing that keeps all of these things alive, or alive is the wrong word, but that keeps them almost, alive for the prosecution, for the system. One thing that gives it an opportunity for them to continue to wheel out these excuses is because once all of that is said and done, and whether we win those arguments or not, they have the final layer of protection, which is qualified immunity. And now let's just talk about its legal definition once again. And just so that we understand what qualified immunity is, let me read it to you again. And if there's any other alternative explanations, then you guys can come with that when I've finished. But bear with me as I give you this once again as a legal definition to qualified immunity. Qualified immunity protects public officials from being sued for damages unless they violated clearly established law of which a reasonable official in his or her position would have known. I want to come back to that sentence in a minute. It aims to protect civil servants from the fear of litigation in performing discretionary functions entrusted to them by law. I want to come to that in a minute. The qualified immunity test requires a two-part analysis. Part 1. Was the law governing the official's conduct clearly established? I think we're going to come back to that in a minute. And part 2. Under that law, could a reasonable what do they mean by a reasonable officer? What is a reasonable officer? Could a reasonable officer have believed the conduct was lawful? Government officials performing discretionary functions generally are shielded from liability for civil damages as long as their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable, this word comes up again, reasonable person would have known. Firstly, let me just say this. No man, woman, body or thing should be allowed to carry a lethal weapon in the purpose of protect and serving their community if they do not reasonably know or establish statutory constitutional rights the people that they are encountering are protected under. If they are, who's responsible for making sure that these officers understand what law protects them and what law protects us? Because for me, that suggests that actually nobody knows what laws they're being governed by. What is the law?
Exactly,
right.
Kervin. You know, these terms that you're using in this definition of qualified immunity, we've all who have been through this situation have heard these terms used as they're reading the police reports, and they're all subject to interpretation, and they're being interpreted by the judges and the DAs, and not any, like you said, what is a reasonable cause? You know, no one can put their finger on exactly what a reasonable cause is. You know, what reason did you have to use and discharge your weapon in that situation?
Why did you have to shoot somebody 76 times? Why?
Exactly.
Could that be considered reasonable? Shooting a man in the back 3 times while he's laying on the ground and with his head in his blood, is that reasonable?
Apparently so, because these officers who shot this man 76 times, shot his arms and head off, were cleared. So
yes.
again, it's up to their interpretation.
It's legal. That is legal. Yeah.
It's scary to me that they even have to qualify it by using the word reasonable. So I've said this many times, but in law to me is the use of vocabulary, is our language and the interpretation, like you said, and the cases set, the precedents of cases set thereof. So it's kind of simple when you look at it. When I try to speak publicly or anything else, I get really clear about the words that I use, because that's what they're doing in a court of law. And they're using that language. So the word reasonable. So define reasonable police officer. What does that mean? So it's all arbitrary, it's vague. So it is all about interpretation. And that comes back to the people who are interpreting that vocabulary. That's what we're subject to.
And further, it's designed that way. It's designed to be arbitrary and vague, right?
Yep.
That's no accident. You're right, Patrick. That's no accident.
Just carry on a second. I'm looking for something. 1 minute.
It's pretty
It sounds so qualified.
So
immunity sole foundation is to protect the financial loss or gain of security regarding, those in law enforcement or a government official to protect the financial. That's it.
The reason I was, just bear with me. The reason I was doing this was because I really wanted to look up this word reasonable and look at its definitive translation in the dictionary. Having sound judgment, fair and sensible. no reasonable person could have objected. Sensible, rational, logical, fair-minded, just, decent.
So when they use that, are we to assume that everybody else isn't?
Here we go. Right? Understand what we're coming from, right? Because that's what they're saying. But the way that they use this word reasonable in so many of those phrases and paragraphs, right? They're saying that, here's the thing. No, they're not saying that we're not reasonable. They must be saying that these officers are not reasonable. Because these officers should have been, if it was reasonable to know, so if they didn't know, it means that they're not logical, they're not fair, they're not fair-minded, they're not rational, and they're not sensible, and they're not decent.
And the word's used to control, because it's used to control us. When they use the words like reasonable when describing a police officer, we automatically assume that that's what it's there for, that word is put out there so it's in our head to be reasonable. There is no reason behind this.
So let's just go.
The word.
So let's just go back to this, right? Because under that law, could a reasonable officer have believed the conduct was lawful, right? Could a reasonable officer have believed that conduct was lawful? So if they're saying no, a reasonable officer, right, could not have seen that to be wrong. They have the word rational. They have the word sensible. They have the word decent. They have the word logical. They have the word fair. Is it fair to shoot someone 76 times? And are you telling me that office...
All based on perspective. That's all based on the other person's perspective. It's not
absolutely.
It's not a matter of society's perspective. That's that individual. And the judge is always going to give them credence.
And based on what?
They say, well, we weren't there. We don't know what how they were feeling or whatever. But the thing is, when was their last psych evaluation?
Exactly.
What was the outcome of that? Why are these officers still out here when we already know that they're mentally unstable? You know, and their instability is not just a few officers. You would think it's infectious the way that they behave. You know,
Yes.
it's like it's contagious.
It is.
So, you know, these words that they like to use, by definition, only say based on this person's perspective.
Right, instead of using the evidence or the facts. And because they don't use the facts, because if they did that, if the police took the time to collect evidence, and that's where they get most of the families right there, are in that moment, and they want to get things done. They don't look at what really happened in the circumstance. Families are in shock. They don't know what to look for. We look to police to uphold the law, to tell us the truth. That's what we are conditioned to believe in our society. And so we expect them to be reasonable. I don't think it's a word that we need to use to qualify. I would assume that somebody that's upholding the law and quote unquote to keep the peace would, by definition, be reasonable.
So the paraphrase version of the legal definition of qualified immunity is this. If a law enforcement officer is unable to know, understand, or comprehend which civil rights of yours or the victims he has breached, he will qualify for this qualified immunity. In other words, he didn't know that by shooting you 76 times in your back, that was in breach of your civil rights.
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
Wow.
That's what we're talking about here.
Right, and the thing is, those laws, those civil rights that they enjoy, they don't think that they extend to us.
No, but here's the bottom line is qualified immunity does not extend to us, right? We can't shoot somebody 76 times, right? Because we can't get qualified immunity.
No.
If we shoot
a situation here in Detroit where there's a father who is a previous felon, served his time out being a contributing citizen in the United States, taking care of business, a father at home, sees a guy rob his son outside their house, shoot his son. He comes outside to his son's aid. Him and the assailant get to tussling over the gun. He shoots the assailant. The assailant dies. Now, this worthless prosecutor here in Detroit, Wayne County prosecutor Kim Worthy, she's a worthless piece of...
Okay, I get you.
She wants to charge him with another felony and multiple other charges because he shot the guy who shot his son while him and the guy are fighting over the gun. Wow. Now, what kind of retarded shit is that? And that's the only way I could put it.
Listen,
I told my daughter's age, but I'm wrong because I tried to help her. Because I prevented this person from finishing the job and killing her. So now I'm wrong because the person tried to kill me and I shot them. How the
You
hell
took money from law enforcement.
Let me balance it out just a little bit this way. If I got in an altercation with somebody and I pulled out a gun and I shot them once and they died, I'd be charged with murder, right?
Right.
Okay? So I get in an altercation with somebody and I pull out a gun and I empty the chambers of that gun, I reload it and empty it again. What are they going to charge me with? It will still be murder.
Murder.
It will still be murder.
Yeah.
But the level of which they will prosecute me because I have emptied the chamber and because I've shot more than once, because I've shot him 10 times or 15 times, I'm going to be held up as some psychopath. It will be a psychopathic murder. I lost my mind. I must have been some lunatic. I was deranged.
Exactly. I think it segues back to what Yolanda mentioned. And this is what I really love about Yolanda is that she's so solution-oriented. And she talked about that we need to start focusing in on the records of these judges and these DAs and these officers, because they are working together. And just as Judge Menendez ruled in the Desmond Phillips case, we need to put those records under a much finer microscope and look at some of the rulings from these judges and some of the work. And there's even been, even in our case with Taylor Rock, there had been previous cases where the DA had been found by an upper court, a higher court, to have been working too closely together. And I would say that's probably par for the course for most counties throughout the nation, is that these DAs and judges and officers are all part of the same team, and we're not on it.
They actually know each other. They're familiar with each other. They're in the same courtrooms all the time. They play golf together. My dad's friends. Yes. My dad was friends with the DA that was in office when my brother was shot, who subsequently stepped down from office 2 months after Brian was killed to take a job at a third of the pay as a forensic investigator. And I know it had to do with my brother, but that's when we look at things like our Judge Coffin or McShane, and you get this idea of who these people are, and it's based on their personalities. Like, oh, are they going to go this way? Are they going to go that way? Who they know? It needs to be a little clearer in my head anyway, especially when it comes to when it comes to judging. We put so much worth based on somebody's what they judge. How do you do that? It kind of blows me away.
Here's the thing. Here's I told you guys at the beginning of the show that there was, or while we were briefing before the show started, there is one role that I want to fill on this round table, which we don't have represented at the minute, and I'd love to see a retired judge come and sit on this round table, who can talk us through some of the reasonings behind some of the judgments that are given from a professional point of view.
Great.
That would be amazing.
And I'm hunting for a judge that will come and join us. That's what I'm currently looking for. And I've made inquiries about two, and one One was very negative. In fact, he's very ill at the minute, and says that he really just needs to focus on his own health at the moment rather than get involved in anything else. And then the other one hasn't even answered me yet, so I don't know what. I'm not holding my breath, but I am adamant that I will continue in perseverance looking for a judge to join this roundtable team. We've got ex-police officers, we've got Jerry Summers, ex-chief of police, we've got a law attorney, an ex-law enforcement officer in Jonathan Newton when he's really tied up at the minute. He's got a lot of stuff going on for him, I know that, but he is a member of our roundtable team, and he'll also be back shortly. And then we have you guys experienced as victims and victim member families who have been campaigning and advocating for those that have gone through what you have gone through as well as what you've gone through for yourselves. So I'm really looking to put together something that really can represent wrongful convictions and unlawful killing in a real way, enable us to start presenting formulas that look like change and reform that we can present to government officials to go and take to the White House on our behalf. Arguments that people can use in courts of law, for example. So I really do believe that there is a real calling on our lives here, all of us that are called to this round table and the work that we do here on Issues Today on a Saturday. I really do believe there's an objective that we are striving to achieve that I believe is achievable if we are consistent and persistent and persevere. And you guys make up a remarkable team of committed individuals that I feel honoured to sit around a table with. And whether or not we're hundreds and thousands of miles away, we are collectively together spiritually on every occasion we get together. And there is something absolutely beautiful that takes place when we start to talk about these things that we're passionate about.
Absolutely.
Looking back on today, I want to just quickly go back to Stephanie, because Stephanie wanted to really get an understanding of qualified immunity, and did we have a definition of it? Did the definition you hear today, Stephanie, did that make any sense to you? What is your response to that? Did you realize that that's what it was?
Oh yeah, I absolutely know what it is. But that's why I asked, because I don't think a lot of people do. And it really comes down back to the language, and that is so important when you look at the way the words are used. If you read the depositions, if you read the ones that the attorneys write, and the kind of language that they use in the way that they use it. So qualified immunity, and to define the terminology that's used in a court of law, those are the things that we need to understand in order to fight effectively against what we're against qualified immunity.
The abuses.
Yeah, thank you. The abuses. That's right. Thank you, Kervin. And yes, I think that's very important that we bring words like reasonable. Why point that out? Why would somebody qualify describing an officer as being reasonable in that moment? So what kind of circumstances is he unreasonable otherwise? I mean, those are the things we have to look at in order to pull this apart and put it back together again. And
Steph, you've actually hit the nail on the head, because I don't think qualified immunity has ever been stripped apart. And when we strip it apart the way that we've just done so on this show, I can't understand why defense attorneys ain't stripping it apart in a courthouse, in a courtroom, in a defense.
Easy. Yeah.
Right?
They use it. They use it as they use it because it's an accepted term. And so it's defined by how it's been used, and then they just continue to use it over and over again. It's easy.
And it's almost like the moment somebody comes up, well, that's it. Hey, that's qualified immunity right there. Boom. Okay, that's it.
Correct.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Done. Okay, we can't argue now. That's qualified immunity. Qualified immunity have now just come in. That's it. We're done. We're over. We're finished. Kaput. Give up your case.
Yeah.
Let's just throw the towel in now. But what I'm saying is, our loved ones' lives, our loved ones' memories, the legacy that we leave behind us is far too significantly important for us not to argue. We have to argue. And somewhere along the line, we've got to find a way to start getting people to, hey, we've talked. I never heard about qualified immunity until Jonathan Newton raised it on one of the very first roundtables that we did over a year, nearly 2 years ago. And since then, this qualified immunity thing has come up over and over and over again. And we're beginning to hear it used in the courtrooms more often than not. And we're beginning to hear it used in adjudications more often than not. And now we're beginning to hear how that's been thrown up as the excuse, the explanation as to why an officer cannot be prosecuted for what appears to be an apparent misuse of his authority, abuse of his position.
It's a legal crutch. It's just a legal crutch.
But but because nobody's arguing the concept of qualified immunity, right? That is the reason why they can consistently use it over and over again. If somebody went into a courtroom and blew the argument of qualified immunity right out of the courtroom and they lost, do you think that they'd be that quick to bring qualified immunity back in again? They'd have to find a way to rearrange it, reword it, refigure it.
Well, I think it's something, Kervin, that is accepted so broadly by judges. I mean, you can literally shoot someone 76 times, right, and still be given qualified immunity.
Because after you've shot them 76 times, you're totally unaware of what civil right of theirs that you've breached.
Absolutely.
Qualified immunity maintains the power structure that's in place right now. That's what that term does for our justice system. It maintains the power because they don't have to explain it.
No, they don't have to look at the facts. They don't have to consider the facts. They've got a, pardon the phrase, trump card by saying qualified immunity because it trumps every fact. It trumps 76 bullets. I mean, you could define unnecessary force as anything under 80 shots is considered reasonable. I mean, that's the insanity of allowing the system to use the trump card of qualified immunity. It's got to be stripped apart. It's got to be defined.
So you know when we talk about individuals that have been shot so many times that limbs have left the body. So if a law enforcement officer was to use a grenade to blow apart an individual because he was that in fear of his life, that if the individual moved just one iota, they could be dead. And by using that grenade, the individual lost an arm and two legs. Would that be okay? Could that
currently? Yes, under current law, yes,
absolutely. And that's the point.
It actually happened with a small kid in Kansas City a number of years ago, where they threw a flash bomb in the house, wrong house, hurt the kid, got qualified immunity. No one was prosecuted.
How is that even possible?
It's the magic trump card, Kervin. It's obscene, but it's the magic trump card.
You know, my dear friends, we're actually 3 minutes before we've run out of time. And we're still real in the middle of this conversation. We're nowhere near finished yet. So we're going to have to take this back up again at the beginning of next month when we do our next roundtable. And on that one, we're going to be having Christine Bunch join us for the first time. I hope all of you guys will be available to continue with this conversation that we've just had on this particular show. I'd like to take this opportunity first and foremost to thank all of our listeners, our audience right across the world who have partaken and made comments on all of the platforms, social media platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, etc. Those that are on the World Jam Global website. And most importantly, I want to thank you, my guests, Patrick Lane, Scott Russian, Stephanie Babb, Yolanda McNair, and Dee Martin. I want to thank you all for another great contribution to a fantastic conversation and discussion we've had on overkill and the real crime and qualified immunity. We've kind of just run out of time. I don't know if there's anybody that's got anything that they want to quickly add before we go. You've got about 30 seconds. Nope. Okay.
We miss you, Therese.
Yeah.
Hi, Therese.
Yes, Therese.
Hope you feel better.
We thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys. That's all we've got time for. We are out of here. My program's frozen, so I'm just about done. Let's do it.
Dee, can you hear me?